Imagine standing before a palace where tradition and discipline are carved into every stone, where the guards are known for their unshakable composure. Now picture this: a tiny boy, no older than 5, in soft blue pajamas, steps out of the crowd. His small hands clutch a stuffed rabbit as he moves closer to one of the imposing guards. What happens next isn't just unexpected, it's a moment that will stay with you long after this story ends. Stay with us, because this one will leave you speechless. Before we dive into this moving story, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from today. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will stay with you long after they're told. The morning was crisp, with the kind of autumn chill that made breath visible in the air. The palace grounds stretched wide and majestic, bathed in soft sunlight that reflected off the ancient stone walls. Towering gates stood as symbols of history and power, guarded by imposing figures dressed in ceremonial uniforms, scarlet tunics, polished buttons, and tall bearskin hats. These guards were legends of discipline, their stillness so perfect it seemed as though they were carved from the same stone as the palace itself. Tourists swarmed the grounds, their chatter mingling with the clicking of cameras. Families huddled together, children tugging on sleeves to ask questions about the soldiers who stood so silently. Some took selfies with the guards in the background, while others debated if these men were even real. The atmosphere was lively, yet reverent, a mix of awe for tradition and excitement for the spectacle. But amidst this sea of movement and noise, one figure was impossible to miss. He was small, no taller than the waist of most adults around him, and his soft blue pajamas fluttered slightly in the breeze. Bare feet padded softly on the cobblestones, their sound lost in the murmurs of the crowd. His hair was tousled, as though he had just woken up, and in his tiny hands he clutched a stuffed rabbit with one ear half torn. He looked out of place, yet entirely unbothered by it. It was the kind of image that stopped people in their tracks. Conversations hushed as heads turned toward the boy. A woman whispered to her friend, "Where are his parents?" Another man chuckled softly, "What's he doing here like that?" But the boy paid no attention to any of it. He seemed to have a purpose, a quiet determination that belied his tiny frame. And then he took a step forward. The god he approached was a towering figure, his face expressionless beneath the shadow of his bearskin hat. Standing so still, he was almost a part of the palace itself, a symbol of tradition and duty. His rifle was held with precision, his posture unwavering, as if the boy approaching him didn't exist. But the boy saw him. To him, the guard wasn't a symbol or a spectacle. He was just a man, tall and quiet, and maybe, just maybe, someone who needed to be spoken to. The boy shuffled closer, his stuffed rabbit swinging by its threadbare arm. There was no hesitation in his steps, no fear of the imposing figure before him. And as the boy drew nearer, the crowd held its breath. Parents pulled their children closer, unsure of what might happen next. The palace guards were known for their discipline, their unyielding commitment to protocol. They weren't supposed to move, speak, or react to anything. But surely this was different. What could the little boy in pajamas possibly want from a palace guard? And more importantly, what would the guard do? The boy took slow, hesitant steps away from the crowd. He didn't glance back at the people behind him. His focus was ahead. His small hand gripped the stuffed rabbit tightly as he shuffled toward the line of guards. His parents stood frozen a few steps behind, their faces a mix of surprise and worry. "Where is he going?" his mother whispered, clutching his father's arm. His father took a step forward, but then stopped. "Let's see what he does," he murmured, unsure of whether to call the boy back. The crowd around them began to notice. A few people chuckled softly, assuming it was a harmless moment of curiosity. "Look at him," a man said, pointing out the boy to his companion. Others exchanged concerned glances. "Should someone stop him?" an older woman murmured, clutching her handbag. A little girl, holding her father's hand, giggled and asked, "Is he going to talk to the soldier?" The boy moved with a kind of quiet determination that felt unnatural for someone his age. He wasn't distracted by the whispers or the flashing cameras. His bare feet padded gently on the cold stone ground, and his gaze stayed locked on the towering figure ahead. His stuffed rabbit swung slightly in his hand, its worn fur and drooping ears showing signs of love and age. The closer he got, the quieter the crowd became. People shifted their attention from their cameras and phones to the boy. The murmurs faded. Now they weren't just watching. They were waiting. The guard remained still. His tall frame was rigid, his face unreadable. His rifle rested against his shoulder, and his hands were clasped tightly on its stock. His uniform was flawless, his buttons gleaming in the morning light. The weight of his ceremonial hat made him appear even taller, more unapproachable. He had trained for this. No matter what happened, no matter who approached, his job was to remain motionless. But he couldn't ignore the sound of the small footsteps drawing closer. He noticed them first. Not loud enough to distract him, but enough to break the rhythm of the background noise. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught sight of a small figure approaching. The boy's pajamas fluttered in the breeze, and his stuffed rabbit swung loosely by his side. It was an unusual sight, and the guard's instincts began to stir. "Stay still, focus," the guard told himself. He kept his eyes forward, staring past the crowd as if nothing had changed. But his mind was racing. What is he doing? Is he lost? Where are his parents? He fought the urge to glance down at the child. His training demanded discipline. His humanity whispered otherwise. The boy was now only a few feet away. The crowd watched, holding their breath. The contrast between the boy's tiny frame and the imposing figure of the guard was stark. The boy had no hesitation. His bare feet seemed unaffected by the chill of the cobblestones. His pajamas, light and wrinkled, moved gently as he walked. He wasn't afraid. His small, steady steps seemed to defy the expectations of everyone watching. The guard, meanwhile, was a symbol of discipline. His posture was perfect, his boots polished to a mirror shine. He was a professional, trained to ignore distractions of all kinds. And yet, the boy's approach tested him in a way he had never prepared for. The guard's stoic exterior hid the conflict within. He wasn't sure what to do. "This isn't supposed to happen," he thought, "but he's just a kid. What does he want?" The boy stopped just a few inches in front of the guard. He tilted his head back to look up, his wide eyes searching for something in the soldier's face. The crowd leaned in, some craning their necks for a better view. The boy didn't speak. He stood there for a moment, clutching his stuffed rabbit, as if deciding what to do next. Then he reached out. His small hand stretched toward the guard's polished boot. His fingers brushed against the smooth leather, leaving a faint smudge from his touch. It was such a simple, innocent action, yet it carried a strange weight. The crowd gasped softly. A woman near the front whispered, "Oh my God, he touched him." For the boy, it was just a curious gesture. He wanted to feel the shiny boots that reflected the sunlight. For the guard, it was something entirely different. No one was supposed to touch him. No one was supposed to cross that invisible barrier. And yet, here was this child, breaking the rules without even knowing they existed. The moment seemed to stretch on forever. The boy looked up again, his eyes filled with wonder, as if waiting for the guard to respond. The guard, towering above him, stayed motionless. But inside, he was anything but still. "What do I do?" he thought. "Do I react? Do I stay silent?" The crowd waited. The air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. The boy's innocence had created a crack in the guard's stoic armor, and everyone could feel it. The boy's small hand lingered on the polished leather of the guard's boot, leaving a faint smudge against its mirror-like surface. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze. The crowd stood silent, every eye glued to the scene unfolding before them. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if afraid to disturb the fragile tension in the air. The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed ahead. His training told him to ignore it, to stay still, to let the moment pass. But the warmth of the boy's hand, so small and innocent, burned through the barriers of his discipline. He fought against the instinct to look down, his grip on the rifle tightening. "Do not react," his mind urged. "This is your duty." But duty was no match for humanity. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the guard shifted. His shoulders eased, his posture softened, and for the first time, he lowered his gaze. The crowd noticed the change immediately. A gasp rippled through the onlookers, quiet but full of wonder. The towering figure, so stoic and unyielding just moments ago, had become something else. Human. The boy looked up, his wide eyes meeting the guard's. He didn't smile or giggle. Instead, he tilted his head, studying the man before him with quiet curiosity. For the boy, this wasn't an act of rebellion or courage. It was simple. He saw someone standing alone, still and silent, and he wanted to know why. Without hesitation, he held out his stuffed rabbit. The toy dangled from his tiny hand, its fur woe in one ear flopping to the side. The boy's voice was soft but clear. "Do you want this?" he asked. "You can hold it if you're lonely." The words were innocent, spoken without hesitation or doubt. They cut through the silence like a knife, reaching every ear in the crowd. A woman near the front covered her mouth, her eyes brimming with tears. A man whispered to his companion, "Did you hear that? The boy thinks he's lonely." The guard stared at the rabbit for a long moment. His mind raced. "What do I do?" he thought. "I'm not supposed to move. I'm not supposed to break protocol." But the boy's words echoed in his mind, piercing through years of rigid training. Slowly the guard bent down. The crowd held its collective breath, the tension so thick it was almost tangible. The boy didn't flinch. He stood still, holding out the rabbit with unwavering determination. The guard knelt, his tall figure folding gracefully to meet the child's gaze. The boy smiled faintly, as if reassured by the gesture. The guard didn't take the rabbit. Instead, he whispered, his voice low and soft, "Thank you, but I can't. You keep him safe for me, okay?" The boy nodded, his expression serious. He hugged the rabbit close to his chest, as if accepting an important responsibility. Then, with the same small voice, he asked, "Are you tired, standing here all day?" The question was simple, yet profound. The guard blinked, caught off guard by the child's concern. How can he see what others don't? He wondered. He gave the boy a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was an answer without words, but the boy seemed to understand. The moment stretched on, filled with a quiet kind of magic. The crowd, once lively and loud, stood still, captivated by the interaction. Parents held their children closer, their faces a mix of awe and emotion. A few people wiped away tears. It was as if the little boy had broken down an invisible wall, reminding everyone of the humanity behind the uniform. Finally, the guard straightened, returning to his full height. His face resumed its calm, disciplined expression, but something had changed. The boy waved at him, his small hand flapping in the air. The guard didn't wave back, he wasn't allowed to, but there was a slight shift in his posture, a softness in his stance that hadn't been there before. "What?" The boy turned and walked back toward the crowd, his rabbit tucked securely under his arm. His parents rushed to him, their relief obvious. His mother knelt down, holding his shoulders gently. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The boy shrugged, his answer as simple as his actions. He looked like he needed someone to talk to. The guard watched them leave, his face stoic once more, but his thoughts far from still. The boy's words echoed in his mind, a quiet truth that refused to be ignored. He didn't speak. He didn't move. But for a fleeting moment, he wasn't just a guard. He was a man who had been seen, not as a symbol but as a person. For a moment no one spoke. The crowd stood frozen, as if the entire scene was a painting come to life. Then, like a wave, the emotions spread. Quiet murmurs filled the air as people tried to process what they had just witnessed. A woman standing near the front dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her lips trembling with a soft smile. "I've never seen anything like that," she whispered to the man next to her. A young father crouched to speak to his own daughter, who clung to his leg. "Did you see how brave he was?" he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. The girl nodded solemnly, her small fingers clutching the edge of her jacket. "The soldier smiled," she whispered back, as if afraid to break the fragile magic of the moment. In the back, a teenage boy snapped a photo of the scene, the sound of his phone's shutter barely audible over the murmurs. "That was insane," he muttered, showing the image to his friend. "I've been here so many times, and the guards never move. Ever." Nearby, an elderly man chuckled quietly, shaking his head. "Leave it to a child to remind us that even the toughest of us are still human," he said, leaning on his cane. The energy in the crowd shifted from curiosity to warmth. Some people clapped gently, the sound hesitant but sincere. Others simply stood in silence, letting the moment linger. Strangers exchanged knowing glances, connected by the rare beauty of what they had witnessed. The boy's parents finally moved. His mother knelt down, pulling him close, her hands trembling slightly as she brushed his messy hair out of his face. "What were you thinking?" she asked, her voice a mix of scolding and relief. But her eyes betrayed her. There was pride there too, shining through her worry. The boy tilted his head, confused by her reaction. "I just wanted to talk to him," he said simply, hugging his stuffed rabbit tighter. His mother shook her head, laughing softly as she hugged him. "You scared me," she murmured, "but you did something amazing." His father stood nearby, his hands resting on his hips. He looked from the boy to the guard and then back again. "You've got courage, kid," he said finally, ruffling his son's hair. "I'm not sure I'd have the guts to do that." The family turned back to the crowd, aware that dozens of pairs of eyes were still watching them. The mother smiled awkwardly, mouthing a quick thank you to no one in particular. The father gave a small nod of acknowledgement before they gently guided their son back into the throng of people. The boy looked over his shoulder one last time, his gaze returning to the guard who still stood at the gates. The guard had returned to his full height. His posture was once again flawless, his rifle steady in his hands. But something about him was different. His shoulders, which had been rigid and tense, now seemed more relaxed. His face was calm, but there was a hint of something new in his expression, a faint softness that hadn't been there before. He kept his gaze forward, but his mind lingered on the boy. The sound of the child's voice, the simple offer of the stuffed rabbit, replayed in his head. "You can hold it if you're lonely." The words struck a chord he hadn't expected. They stayed with him, filling a space that had been quiet for far too long. The crowd slowly began to disperse, their conversations buzzing with what they had just seen. But the guard remained still, his discipline unwavering. It was his duty to stay strong, to return to his role as the unshakable figure the public expected him to be. And yet, as he stood there, he felt different. Lighter, perhaps, more human. In the distance, the boy's laughter carried on the breeze as he rejoined his parents. He waved once more, a small, cheerful gesture that only the guard could see. The guard didn't wave back. He couldn't. But there was a subtle shift in his stance, a small tilt of his head that almost felt like a nod. It was the only response he could give, but it was enough. As the day went on, the palace grounds returned to their usual rhythm. More tourists arrived, snapping photos and marveling at the grandeur of the scene. But those who had been there that morning carried something with them, a story to tell, a moment to remember. They had witnessed something rare, something that cut through the everyday routines of life and reminded them of what it meant to connect. The guard stood tall once more, his posture rigid, but his thoughts were far from still. As the crowd thinned, leaving behind the hum of distant voices, his mind wandered. The boy's actions had stirred something deep within him, something he hadn't allowed himself to think about in a long time. Years ago, the guard had been a father. He had a son, not much older than the boy in the pajamas. His son had the same fearless curiosity, the same way of looking at the world with unshakable innocence. The guard could almost hear his son's voice, high-pitched and full of excitement, asking endless questions about the world around him. But life had changed. His son wasn't here anymore. It wasn't a story he shared often. The details felt like they belonged to another lifetime. A car accident on a rainy night, the gut-wrenching phone call, and the days that followed, blurred by grief. He had buried his emotions, locking them away behind the same discipline that now held him still at his post. When the boy touched his boot and held out the stuffed rabbit, it wasn't just a gesture. It was a memory. It reminded him of the stuffed bear his son had carried everywhere, its fur worn in places from being hugged too tightly. For the guard, that moment wasn't just an interruption in duty, it was a connection to something he thought he had lost forever. The boy, now walking hand in hand with his parents, had his own reasons for approaching the guard. To him, the guards weren't just statues in red uniforms. They were heroes, brave and strong, standing tall to protect something important. He had seen them in pictures and on television, always still and serious, and he had been fascinated. But there was something else, something he didn't fully understand, but felt in his heart. He had noticed the guard's expression from a distance. To him, it wasn't just discipline or focus. It looked like loneliness. It was the kind of feeling a child picks up on, even if they can't explain it. He had turned to his parents and said, "I think he needs a friend." His parents had smiled, thinking it was just another one of his innocent remarks. They hadn't stopped him when he walked toward the guard, assuming he would lose interest and come back. But he hadn't. Instead, he had clutched his stuffed rabbit tightly, the one his grandmother had given him before she passed away, and walked forward with purpose. The rabbit was special to him. It had been his comfort during moments of sadness, a source of strength when he felt unsure. Offering it to the guard wasn't just a random gesture. It was his way of sharing something that had made him feel better in the past. In his mind, the guard looked like he needed it more than he did. The guard's thoughts lingered on the boy's question, "Are you lonely?" He had heard it clearly, even though the boy's voice was soft. It wasn't a question he could answer, but it was one he had been asking himself for years. Standing at his post, surrounded by people, yet completely separate from them, had always been a strange kind of solitude. The crowd never saw him. They saw the uniform, the tradition, the role. But the boy had seen him. The weight of that realization pressed on him. He hadn't been seen like that since his son. The boy's innocence had cut through the layers of protocol and routine, reaching a part of him he thought he had buried. He thought of the child's gesture, the offer of the rabbit, and how much it reminded him of his son's small but meaningful acts of kindness. For the boy's parents, the moment had been unexpected, but now they understood. As they walked away, his mother knelt to speak to him again. "Why did you give him your rabbit?" she asked gently. The boy paused, looking down at the toy in his hands. "Because he looked like he needed a friend," he said simply, shrugging as if the answer was obvious. His father, walking beside them, smiled. "That's very kind of you," he said, his voice low with emotion. He reached down to squeeze his son's shoulder. "You know, not everyone would think to do something like that." The boy tilted his head, thoughtful. "But he's a hero," he said. And heroes need friends too. For the god, the day passed slowly, but the boy's actions stayed with him. As the sun began to set and the palace grounds emptied, he found himself thinking about the boy's words again. The simple question, the small gesture. It wasn't much, but it had meant everything. In that moment, he realized something he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't invisible. Even behind the uniform and the role, someone had seen him. A child, with nothing to gain and no expectations, had reminded him of what it meant to be human. He remained at his post until the shift ended, his face calm and unreadable as always. But inside, something had changed. The memory of the boy, with his blue pajamas and stuffed rabbit, stayed with him, warming a part of his heart that had long been cold. And as he walked back to his quarters that evening, he carried not just the weight of his duty, but also the quiet gift of a moment he would never forget. The moment didn't end when the boy walked away. Among the crowd, someone had their phone out recording everything. The guard's quiet reaction, the boy's innocent gesture, and the emotion rippling through the onlookers were all captured in just a few seconds of video. By the time the day was over, that clip had already begun making its way across social media. It started small, shared among friends, commented on by strangers. But the simplicity of the moment struck a chord. Within days, millions had watched the video. People from all walks of life, from every corner of the world, saw the little boy in his pajamas offering a stuffed rabbit to a palace guard. They read captions like, "Kindness has no boundaries," or "Even the strongest among us need a moment of connection." The story spread faster than anyone could have expected. For the tourists who had been there, it became more than just a memory. Many of them shared what they had seen with friends and family, describing how a small act of kindness had stopped them in their tracks. One man wrote, "I've visited that palace a dozen times, but I've never seen anything like this. It reminded me that even in the most rigid traditions, there's room for humanity." An older woman who had been standing near the boy's family decided to pay the palace another visit. "I wanted to see if I could spot that guard again," she explained to her daughter later. "I just wanted to tell him what a difference he made, not just to that boy, but to all of us who were there." Others reflected inwardly. A mother who had witnessed the scene found herself thinking about her own children. "It made me realize how much adults overcomplicate things," she said. "Sometimes, all it takes is a simple gesture to make someone feel seen." The video's viral reach inspired conversations around the world. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a rare moment of tenderness in an otherwise structured world. "Palace guards are known for their unshakable discipline," one commentator said. "But this story shows us that even within tradition, there's room for connection." Online, the boy became a symbol of innocence and kindness. People shared stories about times they had witnessed or experienced similar acts of compassion. Comments poured in, ranging from simple messages of admiration to deeply personal anecdotes. "This reminds me of the time my daughter handed her balloon to a firefighter," one person wrote. "They have so much on their shoulders, and sometimes it's these little moments that make it easier." The guard's perspective also became a topic of discussion. Some speculated about what he might have been thinking in that moment. Others pointed out the significance of his subtle response. "It wasn't just about breaking protocol," one post read. "It was about recognizing the boy's courage and responding in a way that honored it." The boy, meanwhile, returned to his everyday life. He didn't fully understand the attention the moment had gained, but his parents began receiving messages from people who had seen the video. A teacher from another country wrote to say how she was using the story to teach her students about kindness. A father wrote to thank them, saying, "This story helped me explain to my son why it's important to always notice the people around us." For the boy's family, the event became a cherished memory. His mother often found herself replaying the scene in her mind, her son's quiet bravery, his simple question to the guard, and the warmth that followed. "It's not something you plan," she said to a friend. "It's just who he is. He saw someone who looked like they needed a friend, and he did what felt right." For the guard, the moment stayed with him long after his shift ended. He hadn't been aware of the cameras, nor had he anticipated the impact of his small response. But in the quiet of his quarters, he thought about the boy's words. "Are you lonely?" It wasn't a question he could easily answer, but it was one he continued to reflect on. Days later, he found himself at the same post, scanning the faces in the crowd. He didn't expect to see the boy again, but he noticed more people smiling at him than usual. A few even waved shyly as they walked by. It wasn't something he was used to, but he found that he didn't mind. One afternoon, a young girl approached with her father. She didn't come as close as the boy had, but she held up a small bouquet of flowers and left it near his feet before hurrying away. Her father smiled and gave a small nod, as if to say, "Thank you." The moment had created a ripple effect, touching lives far beyond the palace gates. It reminded people of something simple but often overlooked: the power of connection. In a world filled with rules, schedules, and distractions, this small act of kindness had broken through. It showed that even the smallest gestures could reach the hearts of those around us. In the end, it wasn't just about the boy or the guard. It was about the reminder that beneath the surface, beneath uniforms, roles, and expectations, we're all human. And sometimes, it takes the unfiltered honesty of a child to bring that truth to light. What would you have done if you were the guard or the boy? Have you ever experienced a moment like this, where kindness broke through the ordinary? Share your story in the comments, and let's spread the message of compassion. Because sometimes the smallest actions can lead the biggest impact.